I found it in my husband's glove compartment, a cheap tube of lubricant, the silver cap smudged with fingerprints, still streaked with something dry. The garage light shone down, cold and still, making it look like an object capable of lying. The air smelled of gasoline, old leather seats, and a sharp sweetness, jasmine mixed with the scent of a perfume that wasn't mine. I stood still, my hand clenched until it turned pale. I didn't cry, didn't scream, only silence. Because I knew sometimes silence is the first step of revenge, that little tube lay in my palm, light as nothing but heavy as the guilt of a man who had forgotten what he once swore. 40 years of marriage, and in the end, truth didn't come from confession, but from a cheap piece of plastic that smelled fake. I opened the cap, and the artificial scent hit me, brazen, cold, soulless. In that moment, I saw my life: the mornings by the oven, the evenings of his late meetings, the nights I sat before a cold cup of tea. It all condensed into one small thing, transparent and sticky, like betrayal itself. I placed it on the seat and walked to the tool cabinet. There was a tube of industrial superglue I had once used to fix the oven, the kind that was scentless, clear, emotionless, and once dry, nothing could separate it. I placed the two tubes side by side, one for the flesh, one for the lies, both sticky, both smooth, both capable of ruining everything. I opened the lubricant and poured out all the contents into the trash bag. The clear liquid oozed out slowly, glittering like drops of glass. I wiped the inside clean, then carefully squeezed in the glue, thick, smooth, even. I did it with the precision of a baker measuring grams of flour and seconds of fire. No trembling, no hesitation. I tightened the cap, wiped the rim, adjusted the angle, then put it back into the glove compartment spot, same direction, as if no hand had ever touched it. Everything looked perfect, so perfect it sent a shiver through me at my own calmness. When I closed the compartment, the click sounded like the lid of a coffin sealing away trust. I looked around the garage. The fluorescent light fell on the gray cement floor, my shadow long and warped, looking like someone else, the woman who had just awakened after 40 years of misplaced faith. I washed my hands with lemon soap. On my thumb remained a small patch of dry glue, faint and stiff, impossible to remove. I lifted my hand, studying it, then smiled faintly. Perhaps every betrayal leaves a trace. People just don't dare to look closely. I walked back into the house. In the kitchen, the pendulum clock my mother gave me still swung steadily, its tick-tock beating against my heart. On the table, his phone glowed. A new email, a short line bright in the dark. "You were unforgettable tonight, E." 6 words and 1 heart, but enough for me to know it was over. I took a screenshot, then set the phone down like evidence. The door opened. Edward stepped in, his coat wet from rain, that foreign perfume filling the room again. "Terrible weather," he said evenly, smooth as ever. "Dinner in Atlanta dragged on forever." I looked at him and nodded, my mouth still curved in a smile. "I'm glad you're home," I said softly. "Go shower, I'll make coffee." As he passed by, I noticed the hem of his pants streaked with red Savannah soil, not Atlanta's. I knew it because I'd been there with him once, back when love was still clean. But now, only the memory stayed pure. People did not. I stood in the kitchen, pouring mint tea, watching the steam fade. On the fridge, I stuck a note. "Some stains will never dry." That night, while he slept, I sat in the dark, listening to the rain weaken outside, the clock ticking, and the scent of absolute jasmine from the garden, something honest, not fabricated. And inside me, there was only emptiness. But within that emptiness, I knew one thing for sure. Tomorrow morning when he drives, when his hand opens the glove compartment, he will touch the truth kind that sticks forever. And I will just sit here, finishing my cold tea, listening to the ticking clock, and wait. Wait for guilt to find its way home. What do you think that man will say when he realizes his mistake has stuck with him for good? Stay tuned, because when betrayal finally dies, that's only where the story begins. The next morning, Edward's car engine started at 6:30. I stood in the kitchen, holding a cup of mint tea, watching through the window as the black SUV pulled out of the driveway. The early sunlight cut through the row of pines, reflecting off the windshield, and in that moment, I realized some mornings look so ordinary you never suspect they're carrying an ending. The sound of the engine faded, then vanished. The house returned to silence. I stayed where I was, motionless, listening to my heartbeat, each thump like a clock ticking backward. Part of me wanted to run out, scream, and make him confess. But the other one that had lived in its own shadow for 40 years told me I didn't have to. Truth doesn't need to be chased. It rises on its own, like dough under heat. I sat down, took a deep breath, and let my memory pull me back to where everything began. I met Edward in Charleston in 1981, when I was 25, working as a baker in a small shop called Butter and Salt. He came every morning, ordering the same thing: a butter croissant and black coffee, always sitting by the window where the morning light made his hair glow like pine wood. Every day, I saw him holding a newspaper, marking notes with his pen, occasionally looking up and smiling. That man, I thought, had eyes that made others believe in the future. He proposed to me on Sullivan's Beach, one August afternoon. We were married in a small church with only hydrangeas and organ music. As I walked down the aisle, my mother squeezed my hand and whispered, "Hold on to the man who listens to you." I believed that for half my life. The early years were simple: a small wooden house, a second-hand oven, and a dream of opening my own bakery. I still remember the first day Harbor Hearth opened. I stood behind the counter, hands trembling, afraid the dough hadn't risen enough. Edward stood outside wearing a blue shirt, smiling, telling customers, "She's my wife, and her pastries are the best in town." I truly believed happiness smelled like melted butter and my husband's laughter. Then the years began to change quietly, like the first wrinkle at the corner of an eye. Edward switched to real estate. He started traveling more, saying, "The market is booming, and we need to seize the opportunity." I never objected. I thought if I ran the bakery and he built the future, we were building something together. But we slowly disappeared. I worked 12 hours a day, baking, packing, delivering, and signing contracts. Each time he came home, he told stories about hotels, restaurants, and important people he met. I sat there, smiling politely, realizing that in all his stories there was no place for me. I was the woman in the background, one who brewed the coffee, set the table, wiped flour from the counter, one he referred to simply as, "My wife, she bakes." The house began to feel empty. Full of things, full of flowers, but void of warmth. When he traveled, I slept beside a cold pillow. I remember waking in the middle of the night, hearing the clock ticking, feeling as if I only existed to fill a void. Once, on our 25th Christmas together, I prepared dinner: roast chicken, apple pie, and even made the mulled wine he loved. I waited until 9 that night, but he didn't come home. When I called, he said, "I'm having dinner with a client, can't leave the table. Go to bed, Juliet." I looked at the Christmas tree sparkling in the living room, the lights reflecting off our wedding photo on the wall, 2 young people grinning with hope. I turned off the lights, skipped dinner, and sat in the dark until I heard the door unlock past midnight. He walked in, smelling of women's perfume mixed with red wine. I asked, "Who are you drinking with?" He answered without looking at me, "Someone I needed to close a deal with, Juliet. Don't make things complicated." I stayed quiet because I had learned to be silent to keep the peace. But peace is not the same as calm. In 2005, I opened the second branch of Harbor Hearth. I used my savings, signed the lease myself, and designed the counter myself. On opening day, Edward didn't show up. He said he was meeting partners in Dallas. That night, I cut the ribbon alone, listening to customers laugh, but inside I felt hollow. The next day, he sent a bouquet of red roses with a hastily written card, "Proud of you, E." I kept that card for years, pasted it in my planner, as if clinging to something I already knew wasn't real. When Daniel, our only son, got married, I thought that at least then Edward would find joy and come back to us. But even at the wedding, I saw his gaze wander not at the bride, not at the groom, but somewhere distant and cold. I remember that night clearly. As we cleaned the tables, Allison, my daughter-in-law, smiled at me sweetly and said, "You're so good at keeping everything perfect." I didn't know that years later, That sentence would haunt me. In recent years, when my hair had turned gray, when Harbor Hearth had 3 branches, and my name appeared in the local magazine, Edward had grown even more distant. He began calling me by my name instead of dear. He ate separately, stayed up late, and talked business with strangers more than with his wife. And every time I asked, he only said, "Juliet, don't be paranoid. I'm just tired." But women who have lived long enough without love know this. Fatigue doesn't make a man change his perfume. Fatigue doesn't make him delete messages every night. Fatigue doesn't make him come home late, wearing the smile of someone who just left another's arms. And last night, when I opened that glove compartment and saw the lubricant memories, the tiny cracks over 40 years suddenly clicked into a single, complete picture. I no longer doubted. I knew. I also understood that for men like Edward, betrayal isn't just physical. It's a habit of believing they deserve more lovers, more praise, more chances. And I, the woman who spent half her life baking, believing, waiting, was left only with the smell of burnt butter and a dry patch of glue on my hand. I looked down at the table where the morning light fell. In my cup, the mint leaves had sunk, the color deepened like my heart. I didn't know exactly what I would do next, only that for the first time in years I wasn't afraid. Not afraid to lose him, not afraid to be alone, not afraid of the truth. Because sometimes the scariest thing isn't that someone betrays you, but that you've let them do it for far too long. Have you ever woken up and realized your marriage had ended years ago? You just hadn't dared to name it yet? Stay tuned, because in the next part, Juliet will uncover something even more painful than the plan her husband and daughter-in-law have been hiding. 2 days later, Savannah turned cold without warning. That morning, I opened the kitchen window, and the wind carried mist and salt from the river. The lavender bushes on the porch bent low, and I felt my heart tilt with them. From the garage came the sound of Edward's engine starting, a familiar sound that now echoed like a warning bell. He walked into the kitchen, his shirt pressed, tie neatly adjusted. I watched him make coffee, every movement precise and practiced, like a man performing a scene he had rehearsed 1,000 times. "You're leaving early?" I asked calmly. "Yeah," he replied without looking at me. "New client in San Antonio. Might be back late." I nodded, pouring water into the flower pot. In that moment, I noticed something different. The jacket he wore wasn't the one hanging in the closet last night. This one was new, expensive, and the collar was still fragrant. That scent of jasmine and vanilla is still there, faint but unmistakable. The scent I had found in his car. As he bent to tie his shoes, I saw his hands tremble slightly, like a man hiding a heavy secret in his pocket. I wanted to ask, but instead I smiled and said, "Make sure you take the warm coat, it's cold out." He looked up, caught my eyes, and hesitated. "I know," he said softly, nodding before leaving. The door closed gently, yet the echo through the empty house felt as heavy as an unspoken goodbye. I cleaned the table, washed the cups, and as I wiped the counter, I noticed something small but sharp enough to make my heart skip. On the rim of his cup was a faint lipstick stain, a dark plum shade. I hadn't worn lipstick in 10 years. I stared for a moment, then wiped it away slowly, like erasing someone else's sin. That afternoon at the bakery, Mrs. Peterson, my neighbor who always came for waffle cookies, walked in, her face glowing with gossip. "Juliet, did you hear?" she said, drawing out her words. "I heard your husband just bought a little house in the Southern Hills. Beautiful place, with a jasmine garden out back." I smiled politely. "Oh, you must be mistaken. Edward only rents properties for clients." "Really? But the land manager said he signed the papers himself." My hand froze midair, and the spatula fell onto the counter. "What did you say?" "Yes, full name Edward Roberts. I thought you already knew." I forced a smile. There must be some mistake. But when she left, my smile dissolved. I couldn't stop wondering about the house with Jasmine. The woman who smelled like jasmine and vanilla. Was fate mocking me with the same cruel details on repeat? That night, I tried to act normal. Edward came home late. I heard the car stop around 9. He walked in, hung his jacket on the chair, kissed my cheek lightly, his voice hoarse. "I'm exhausted, Juliet. Let's talk tomorrow." I nodded, watching him climb the stairs. The warm light brushed his back, and in that light, I saw a long, golden strand of hair caught in his collar. Not mine. I held it between my fingers, the chill running straight to my bones. I took it to the kitchen and laid it on the oak table. The hair was small, fine, but it shimmered like a thread stitching two lives together, and I didn't know which side I was being sewn into. I opened my phone, looked again at the screenshot of that old email. The words, "You were unforgettable tonight, E," carved deeper into my heart. I turned on airplane mode and set the phone down. That night I didn't sleep. I just sat there, listening to the steady snore from the sound of a man who'd learned to sleep peacefully on lies. The next morning, when the first light slipped through the curtains, I knew I couldn't just stand by. I thought of Mrs. Miller, the old friend who had helped me open my first shop. She once told me, "Juliet, if you ever need to know the truth, call me. I know someone good, discreet." Back then, I laughed. I never thought I'd need someone like that. But now, I opened my phone and searched for her number. "Mrs. Miller, it's me, Juliet," I said, my voice rough from lack of sleep. She paused, then asked, "Juliet, is something wrong?" I replied briefly, "I think Edward is hiding something. Maybe someone." Silence for a few seconds. Then she said, "I understand. Give me a moment. I'll send you Thomas's number." 5 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a message. "Thomas, private investigator, discreet, reliable." I read it over and over, like someone standing before a new door without knowing where it leads. That afternoon, I met him at a small cafe downtown. I chose a corner seat, back to the window, where the light touched only half my face. When Thomas walked in, I realized he wasn't what I expected. Short, compact, with deep eyes that had seen too much. "I'm Juliet Roberts," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "My husband. I think he's cheating." Thomas nodded, opened a small notebook. "Do you have any evidence?" I reached into my bag, pulled out my phone, showed him the screenshot of the email, the photo of the lubricant tube, and the golden strand of hair sealed in a plastic bag. "This is all I have," I said. He looked at each photo, expressionless. "I understand. I'll start surveillance this afternoon. Don't worry, I'm discreet. No one will know." I nodded, gripping my coffee cup, feeling as though I had just placed my entire past and dignity on the table. When I stepped out of the cafe, the street wind was strong. Dry leaves spun around my feet. Amid the rush of people, I realized I was no longer the woman who only waited. Something inside me had awakened a cold clarity, a flame lit from the ashes of trust. That afternoon, when I returned to the bakery, everything looked the same. The smell of flour, the hum of the oven, the chime of the door. But inside me, something had changed forever. I began to watch, to listen, to note. I started keeping every receipt, every cent, every call. I knew that when people start lying, they leave traces, and I, who once timed every second of baking, would know exactly when the truth was ready to rise. Do you believe that those who betray always leave a trace, only that the betrayed must be brave enough to face it? Stay tuned, because in the next part, Juliet will receive the first photograph. The betrayer will not only be her husband, but the woman she once called her daughter. 3 days later, Thomas texted me in the evening while I was at the bakery with flour still clinging to my hands. "Mrs. Roberts, I have something you need to see. Meet me at the Blue Finch, 8 p.m. Just 11 words, but my heart beat faster than the mixer thundering behind me. I wiped my hands, changed clothes, and then drove across the bridge. Savannah's night was damp and heavy with the smell of river water, the lights reflecting on the wet road like smeared memories. I stopped in front of the cafe, where soft jazz drifted out from inside. Thomas was already at the corner table, a black coffee before him, a file neatly placed. "You should brace yourself," he said when I sat down. I nodded. "I only need the truth." He slid a brown envelope toward me. I opened it, my hands trembling slightly. Inside were photos, printed dimly under yellow light. Edward in the familiar blue shirt holding hands with a woman as they walked into a restaurant. The way he looked at her was gentle, almost tender. I looked closer and my heart stopped. The woman was Allison, my daughter-in-law. I touched the edge of the photo, feeling cold metal stab at my skin. They sat next to each other, too close to be father-in-law and daughter-in-law. She leaned in laughing, her hand on Edward's wrist, the light glinting off the wedding ring I had given her on the day she married Daniel. Thomas watched me, his voice low. "I also have video, but you shouldn't watch it here." I pressed my lips together and nodded. "Give me a copy." He nodded, pulled a small USB from his pocket, and placed it in my palm. "I'll keep watching." They see each other often, in hotels, restaurants, sometimes in broad daylight. I didn't cry, didn't speak. I only stared at the USB's limb, light yet heavy enough to bring down the house I had built with a lifetime. By the time I got home, the clock was nearing midnight. I sat at the kitchen table and opened the laptop. The blue light washed over my face, pale, unfamiliar. I plugged in the USB. The video played. The camera was far but clear. Edward and Allison sat in a hidden corner of Le Bon Jardin. I recognized the place we had gone to for our 10th anniversary. They talked, laughed, then he reached out and touched her cheek. Allison tilted her head and smiled softly, her mouth curving like a victor's. I hit pause, and the light froze on Edward, the man who once promised to stand against the world to protect me. Now he was protecting someone else from me. I opened the second photo. The two of them stood by Edward's SUV, his hand on her waist, his smile light as air. Inside me, something snapped, not my heart, but the sound of the word "we" that had echoed in my head for 40 years. I rewound and pressed play again. Beneath the restaurant's blurred background noise, I heard the sound of two people who didn't know they were being watched. That sound was soft, but it cut deeper than any confession. I shut the laptop and leaned back. The kitchen sank into silence. Only the tick-tock of the clock remained beating on the grave of trust. The next morning I still went to the bakery. Everything looked the same: flour, ovens, regular customers. But I realized even yeast can't mask the smell of rot. When I poured coffee for Mrs. Peterson, she asked gently, "Juliet, is your daughter-in-law well? I saw her with Edward yesterday, thought they were looking at houses." I looked up and smiled. They were. Edward said he wants to buy a house for Daniel. Goodness, what a thoughtful man. I only smiled, and for the first time, I realized that a smile can be the perfect mask. In the afternoon, I received a message from Thomas. "They're at the Maple Row Hotel. Do you want me to send pictures?" I typed back, "No, I want to see for myself." I went. The hotel sat in the historic district, red brick, tall glass windows. I parked across the street and switched to silent shutter. A drizzle fell. I waited nearly an hour. Then they appeared, Edward and Allison, walking out of the lobby together. She wore a black dress, his coat over her shoulders, her head leaning into his. He smiled and tucked her hair behind her ear, a gesture I knew by heart, because I had once been the only one to receive it. I took the shots. 1, 2, 3. My hands shook, but not from the cold. When they got into the car, I headed home, each step heavy as if carrying decades of marriage collapsing behind me. I did not shed a tear. Perhaps my tears had dried long ago, like the superglue stain I still hadn't removed from my finger. That night, I sat in the kitchen, turned on the warm light, and laid the photos in front of me. I arranged them carefully, one by one, like a baker following a recipe. But instead of flour and sugar, I was measuring betrayal. I wrote notes on each picture. Le Bon Jardin Restaurant, 7:45 p.m., Maple Row Hotel, 10:23 a.m. She laughs. He bows his head. I closed the notebook and slipped the USB into an envelope. At the bottom of the drawer, I still kept the business files for Harbor Hearth Company, which I had registered in my name alone. The house, the shops, the savings accounts, all signed by me. A thought flashed. They weren't only betraying me. They were planning something else, because Allison didn't need love from an aging man. She needed something else. Power, assets, my name. I looked around the kitchen heart of the house once upon a time. Now it felt like the scene of a crime without a verdict. I opened the cupboard and found the old flour-dusted apron. Long ago, Edward told me, "You're most beautiful when you're standing at the oven." In hindsight, I realized how foolish I'd been. People say that when they want to keep you there forever. When the clock struck midnight, I called Thomas. "I need you to do one more thing," I said. "Yes, what do you need?" "I want to know what they say when they think no one is listening." Thomas's voice turned serious. "I understand. I have audio equipment. I'll handle it." "Good," I said, my voice flat as steel. "And Thomas, this time I don't want to miss a single word." I hung up, stood, and looked out the window. The rain had stopped. Moonlight reflected off the glass, showing me a face that was no longer the naive, gentle wife, but someone else, quiet, steely, calculating. I turned off the lights and left a single candle burning. The flame flickered over the photo of Edward and Allison smiling together. I pressed the finger with the old glue stain to his face and whispered, "You have no idea, Edward. Every betrayal has a price. And sometimes the bill comes from the person you least expect." CTA, what do you think an ordinary woman will do when the betrayer is not only her husband but her own daughter-in-law? Stay tuned, because in the next part, what they are hiding is not just an affair, but a plan to steal Juliet's entire life. 4 days later, Thomas called me at 9 in the morning. His voice was low, steady, as if he had practiced to keep it emotionless. "Mrs. Roberts, I have the recording. You should listen alone." I paused for a beat. "I'm ready." "Meet me at the old dock behind the fish market. It's quiet there." I arrived half an hour early. Savannah's morning was dim, a mist covering the water, blurring everything like an old silver photograph. The smell of salt, seaweed, and damp wood mixed with the familiar scent of places that hold secrets. Thomas was already waiting, holding an envelope and a small silver recorder. "This was their conversation at Le Bon Jardin 2 nights ago," he said. "I've cleaned the audio so you can hear every word." I nodded, took it, and pressed play. The first voice was Edward's, confident, familiar. "I told you, everything has to happen slowly. Juliet suspects nothing. She trusts me completely." Then came Allison's voice, soft, sweet, but beneath it was the taste of calculation. "I'm not afraid of her, just of Daniel finding out. But if we transfer all of Harbor Hearth's shares to your name first, she'll have nothing left to hold on to." A pause, the faint clink of glasses. "I'll handle it," Edward said. "I told Juliet to sign the financial authorization next week. Once she signs, it's all legal, and you just wait." "I know," she said with a small laugh. "Then you'll finally be free." I stopped the recorder, my heart pounding. That last word cut like a blade. Free, a word he had taken from me for 40 years, now claiming it for himself by stealing what little I had left. I handed the recorder back to Thomas, my voice low. "I need a copy, and I want all evidence stored somewhere safe." He nodded. "Do you want me to keep watching them?" I looked at the gray water ahead and said slowly, "No, I know enough. The rest, I'll handle myself." That evening I came home later than usual. The house was quiet, only the light from the living room spilling out. Edward sat reading the newspaper, a glass of whiskey beside him, the warm yellow glow lighting his face, calm, self-satisfied, as if the world still revolved around him. "You're late," he said, not looking up. "I was at the shop," I replied, pouring water, my tone light. "Busy day." He chuckled, his voice falsely affectionate. "Told you, anything you touch sells. Harbor Hearth stays alive because of you." "Yes," I said, staring at my glass. "Because of me. And it's in my name." He looked up, his smile faltering. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," I smiled. "Just thinking about how it's probably time to audit the accounts." He set his glass down, the sound of glass hitting wood slightly offbeat. "You don't trust me?" "Of course I do," I said softly. "But trust should always be backed by paperwork." For a brief moment, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Worry, quick, but enough for me to know my first strike had landed. The next morning, I went to the family's law office, where Edward usually signed contracts. The receptionist greeted me with a polite smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Roberts. Your husband was just here earlier." "I know," I said. "I just need to review the financial authorization before signing." She hesitated. "Oh, he said you'd already agreed." "I changed my mind," I said, eyes fixed on the folder on her desk. "Let me see it." I opened the file. Beneath all the dry legal jargon, a small clause at the bottom read, "Transfer of full managerial and operational authority of Harbor Hearth LLC to Mr. Edward Roberts in the event of temporary representation." Temporary, two simple words capable of erasing everything. I pressed my lips together, closed the file, and smiled faintly. "Thank you. I'll sign when I feel safer." The receptionist nodded awkwardly. I glanced up at the framed photo of Edward shaking hands with the attorney, his smile wide and confident. I suddenly felt foolish for years. I had let him sign far too many things in my place. That afternoon, I returned to the bakery. Among the scent of butter and coffee and the chatter of customers, I felt an odd calm. I opened my laptop, logged into the company account, and backed up all financial data to an external drive. Then I wrote an email to my personal lawyer, an old friend in Charleston. "Mark, I need to update Harbor Hearth's ownership structure. If anyone tries to transfer authority, freeze it immediately. No need to notify me first." When I hit send, it felt like pulling a knife out of my chest, not for revenge, but to stop the bleeding. That night, I waited for Edward to come home. The clock read 10:30 when his car pulled up. I didn't turn on the lights. He stepped inside, flipped the switch, and froze when he saw me sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of cold tea. "Juliet? You scared me." "I have a question," I said. "The financial authorization, did you insist I sign it so quickly?" He frowned, feigning confusion. "Just a formality. Helps lower our taxes." "I heard," I said, locking eyes with him, "that once I sign, control transfers to you, and someone else is very eager for that to happen." His body stiffened. "Who are you implying?" "I'm not implying," I said evenly. "I'm saying it, Allison." The air thickened instantly. Edward laughed, forced and brittle. "You've been listening to nonsense someone planted." "Maybe," I said softly, tilting my head. "But that nonsense, I have recorded." He froze. "What did you say?" I placed the small recorder on the table. "Do you want to hear your conversation at Le Bon Jardin, or should I let Daniel hear it?" His face went pale, his hand trembling around the glass. In that instant I saw the real Edward, the man addicted to control, now cornered. "Juliet," he whispered, "I'm sorry. It's not what you think." "Not what I think?" I said, my voice steady, lips curling. "You sleep with your daughter-in-law, plot to steal my company, and you think I'm mistaken?" I stood, my tone calm but every word heavy as stone. "I don't need an apology. I just need you to remember that everything you see in this house, that brand name, even the chair you're sitting in, bears my signature. Without me, you're nothing." I turned to leave but paused at the doorway. "You have 3 days to move out. I'm not throwing you, I'm just giving back what you gave me." Silence. I heard the glass shatter behind me, but didn't look back. For the first time in my life, the sound of breaking didn't hurt. It felt light. Do you believe that sometimes the deepest revenge isn't shouting but saying "I know" in the calmest voice possible? Stay tuned, because in the next part, Juliet will face not only Edward but her own son, caught between two betrayers. 3 days had passed since that confrontation. Edward hadn't spoken another word to me. He packed a few personal things and left the house on Tuesday morning without saying goodbye, leaving only the trace of his familiar cologne lingering on the staircase, the scent of deceit soaked deep into the wood. I stood by the window, watching the black SUV disappear beyond the trees. Not relief exactly, just the kind so complete I could hear the kitchen clock counting each beat of freedom. But freedom sometimes comes with truths you aren't ready to face, because that morning, Daniel arrived. He knocked on the door, holding a briefcase, looking as serious as if he were about to walk into a board meeting. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, his tone leaving no room for delay. I invited him in, poured tea as usual, my hands trembling slightly as I set the cup down. "What is it, Daniel?" He looked around the house, the same one that had held his childhood, then stopped at the wedding photo of me and Edward. "Dad said you're misunderstanding things." He said you've been listening to baseless rumors and forced him to move out. I looked him straight in the eyes. So you came to defend your father? No, Mom, Daniel replied, his voice uncertain. I came to ask, did you hire someone to follow him? The air in the room thickened. I didn't answer right away, only folded the napkin in my lap. Yes, I said finally, calm. And I had a reason. Daniel stood abruptly, shocked. Mom, how could you? Could I? I interrupted, still looking straight at him. When that mother finds out her husband is sleeping with her daughter-in-law, that's how, Daniel. The words hit him like a slap. His face paled, then flushed red. What did you just say? I said the truth, I replied. And if you want proof, I have photos and recordings. Daniel stepped back, his voice breaking. No, Allison would never. I stood, opened the drawer, and placed a brown envelope in front of him. Here, listen, watch. Then tell me I'm lying. He hesitated, then opened it. As the sound of rustling paper filled the air, I felt my entire life collapse all over again. He pressed play, listened to the first few seconds of Edward, the voice of Allison, the clink of glasses, and then silence. Daniel set the recorder down, eyes hollow. Oh my God. I didn't touch him, only watched. I didn't know, he whispered. Mom, I swear, I didn't know. I know, I said softly. You're not to blame, but I need you to understand everyone is who you think they are. Daniel lowered his head, his hands covering his face. I need to talk to her. No, I said quickly. You don't need to say anything. Let them expose themselves. He looked up, his eyes red. What do you want me to do? Pretend I don't know? For now, yes, but I can't. Daniel, I said, my tone firm in a way he'd never heard from me. Sometimes silence is the only weapon that makes the betrayer reveal their face. I lived my whole life in silence. Now it's their turn. He stared at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I understand. I just don't know if I have the strength to look at them again. You will, I said, because you didn't cause this. 3 days later, Daniel went to see Allison. She didn't know that I had already shown him everything. According to Thomas, the meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. When Daniel walked in, Allison was folding clothes in the living room. She looked up, smiling softly. You're home early? I thought you were on a business trip. Daniel didn't smile. I just want to ask you something. What is it? What's your relationship with my father? The question froze her. Allison's face went pale, her hands dropping the shirt she held. What are you talking about? Don't act, Daniel said, his voice cracking. I have proof, photos, recordings. She stepped back, trying to keep her voice gentle. I can explain. Don't bother, he cut in. It's clear enough. You didn't just betray, you betrayed my mother, the woman who called you her daughter. Allison began to cry. She reached for him, gripping his hand. Listen to me. I never loved him. I just wanted money, Daniel asked with a bitter laugh. Or the Harbor Hearth name. She collapsed onto the couch, sobbing. I needed security. You were always gone, leaving me alone. He made me feel wanted. Daniel turned away. You know what? My mother once said, women don't need someone to make them feel wanted. They need someone who doesn't make them feel ashamed. Then he left, leaving her sitting on the floor. That evening, Daniel came home. I was on the porch, watching the streetlights shimmer through the trees. He stopped at the doorway, his eyes red but steady. Mom, he said, I know everything, and I'm sorry. I shook my head. You don't owe me an apology. But I owe myself for not seeing sooner. I looked at my son, my eyes full of both love and exhaustion. What matters isn't how late you saw it, but that you dared to believe the truth. We sat in silence for a while. The sound of night insects filled the garden. Daniel asked quietly, What are you going to do? I answered, I won't sue. I just want back what's mine, and I'll let them destroy themselves with their own choices. What about me? He asked. That's up to you, I said, turning to him, but don't forget who always chose you, even when betrayed. Daniel lowered his head and took my hand. Mom, do you still believe in love? I smiled faintly, a smile that tasted of ashes. Love doesn't die, Daniel. It just changes shape. Now, I choose to love the truth instead. That night, I sat down to write in the notebook Edward had given me for our 30th anniversary. I opened the first page, where he once wrote, "To my Juliet, the heart of every home," I added beneath it, "and the one strong enough to burn it down when it rots." I closed the book and blew out the candle. In the dark, I didn't see tears, only the faint silver of moonlight through the curtain, shining on my hand. My thumb still carried the small scar where the glue had once dried. I touched it and whispered, "Thank you for reminding me that everything stuck can be peeled away if it hurts enough. Do you think Juliet will stop after reclaiming her dignity? Or will she make them pay with what they covet most, Harbor Hearth?" Stay tuned, because in the next part, that woman will turn pain into strategy, and emotional justice will begin to bake in her own oven. I began my plan on a December morning when Savannah's breath turned to smoke. Inside Harbor Hearth, the smell of butter and vanilla filled the room. The mixer droned steadily like a heartbeat. From the outside, everything looked normal. But only I knew that from that day on, this place was no longer a bakery but a battlefield. Edward had been out of the house for a week. Allison had vanished from social media, claiming a mental health break. Daniel was staying with me for the time being, speaking little, quietly helping me clean the counter and bake. Sometimes I caught my son looking down at his hands with the eyes of someone who had lost two things at once: trust and youth. I did not blame him. I only thought that perhaps pain must be kneaded like dough, pressed hard before it can rise to the right shape. That morning, I opened my laptop and logged into Harbor Hearth's management system. Invoices and contracts appeared one by one. I reviewed them carefully. Every transaction Edward had signed, every transfer he had made to Allison, every branch he had used as an investment shell, they all carried my name. And that was their fatal weakness. I called Mark, the lawyer in Charleston. "Juliet, I've read the files," he said in a low voice. "All assets belong to you." He only had temporary managerial authority and never executed a transfer. "If you want, I can prepare paperwork to terminate any co-owner role." "I want it done now," I said. "And I want a public copy posted on the state business registry so everyone sees who really holds the name." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." After the call, I sat still for a while. Outside, weak sunlight slid through the window and lit floating dust. I realized the truth is like light. Even when people try to block it, it finds a way through. In the afternoon, I emailed all staff. "Starting today, Harbor Hearth's full operations will return to my control. We will continue as usual. Thank you all for your loyalty and trust through the years." Less than an hour later, my phone vibrated. Edward's name lit the screen. I let it ring and did not pick up. He called twice more, then texted, "What are you doing, Juliet? You will regret this." I looked at the words and smiled. I had once regretted believing, forgiving, and keeping quiet. But no one regrets reclaiming justice. 3 days later, Harbor Hearth celebrated its 20th anniversary. I did not cancel the ceremony. I turned it into a stage for truth. I sent invitations to all partners, customers, the local press, and also to Edward and Allison. I knew they would come. People who hide things always believe they are clever enough to hide them to the end. The event was held at the flagship branch where Edward and I had once cut the ribbon. I chose an ash-gray dress, pinned my hair up, and wore my mother's pearls. In the mirror, the woman looking back was no longer the gentle wife of the past. She was Juliet Roberts, founder of Harbor Hearth, a woman who had survived betrayal. Guests arrived in numbers. Laughter, the clink of crystal, warm light washed over a multitude cake with white letters reading "Harbor Hearth made with love." I stood backstage, my heart beating slowly and steadily, each beat a step counting toward justice. When the host introduced me, I stepped onto the stage. "Thank you, everyone," I began, my voice even and unshaken. "For 20 years, Harbor Hearth has existed because of love, trust, and the honest hands that helped me make every loaf." Applause rose. I paused half a second and looked straight into the crowd. But love and trust are sometimes exploited. And when that happens, we have two choices: silence or standing up. I looked at the front row. Edward sat there in a black suit, his face tense. Beside him, Allison wore white, her lips pressed tight. Daniel sat a few seats away, head bowed, fingers interlaced. I continued. Today, I want to announce something important. As of the 15th of this month, full operational control of the entire Harbor Hearth chain will return to me, its sole founder, and the person legally, financially, and ethically responsible for this brand. A murmur spread through the hall. I raised my hand. And to be clear, here is the updated registration from the Georgia State Business Office. I advanced the slide. The large screen behind me lit up, displaying my name, the confirming signature, and the note, Revocation of Co-Owner Rights Edward Roberts. The room froze. Edward shot to his feet, his voice breaking. Juliet, you have no right. I do, I answered with a smile. Because you never had the right to begin with. I only forgot to take it back. Scattered applause broke out. I bowed my head in thanks and said one last line. Harbor Hearth is not only a place where we bake, it is a place that reminds us that anything stuck to lies will eventually shatter under the heat of truth. After the ceremony, I stepped into the back corridor. Allison hurried after me, her face white. You didn't have to do that in front of everyone, she said, her voice trembling. I turned and met her eyes. And you need to remember this. You entered my home with lies, and now you are leaving it with the truth. She cried. I am sorry. I don't need an apology, I said. I need you to live long enough to understand what it feels like to lose everything you thought was certain. Edward approached, his eyes red with anger. You humiliated me. I looked at him calmly. No, Edward, I read aloud what you wrote, and if you want a peaceful life, stop mistaking women's silence for proof of stupidity. I walked away, leaving them in the corridor, a pair who once believed they could manipulate the world, now stripped bare by truth. That night, I came home. Daniel was waiting with 2 cups of hot tea on the table. Mom, he said, I've never seen anyone as strong as you were today. I smiled softly. It's not strength, son. It is that I finally remembered how weak I once was. I am proud of you. I looked out the window where the night wind moved through the lavender. You don't need to be proud. Just learn to stand when you are pushed down. As for me, I will start again, but this time, no one will take anything from me. Do you believe emotional justice needs neither gunfire nor tears? Only a woman willing to stand before a crowd and say, I know everything now? Stay tuned, because in the next part, Juliet will face something harder than betrayal, learning how to forgive herself. 3 weeks after the Harbor Hearth anniversary, Savannah grew colder. Winter came slowly but stayed long, the kind of chill that seeps into the heart. I still went to the bakery every morning, still opened the doors, still smiled at customers as if nothing had changed, but inside, something had gone quiet. I once thought that when the truth came out, when justice arrived, I would feel lighter. But justice doesn't make the heart any less heavy, it only makes you quieter. Because after the applause fades, there is a silence that stretches on. Daniel had moved back in with me since that day. My son tried to act normal, helping me mix dough, make deliveries, and even repaint the shop sign outside. But between us hung a strange quiet, not born of anger, but of 2 people who had survived an explosion together. You holding up? I asked one evening as we cleaned the counter. He gave a faint smile. I'm fine, Mom. Sometimes I don't know if I'm sad because I lost my wife, or because I didn't see it sooner. My chest tightened. Both are real. But you need to know some wounds don't need bandages. They just need time to stop bleeding. Daniel said nothing more. He nodded, wiped his hands on his apron, and went to lock the door. When it clicked shut, I looked at the closed sign glowing in the streetlight and realized that sometimes you're not just closing a shop, you're closing an entire life. At night, I often sat alone in the living room. The house felt wide and hollow, every object still marked by Edward's touch, the wooden clock he once fixed, the tea set we bought in Charleston, even the sunflower painting he once said, "Looks like sunlight on your skin." Now all I saw was a thin layer of dust over the frame. I didn't want to throw them away. I left everything as it was, the way people keep a small cemetery inside themselves to mourn, but to remember they once lived. One night, I heard the rain. Savannah rain is always heavy, dense, as if someone's knocking on the roof to say, "It's over, but don't forget." I held a cup of mint tea and watched the drops through the window. In the reflection, the woman staring back at me no longer carried anger, only a calm stillness, if every hurt had been baked dry and crisp, incapable of hurting anymore. One early morning after the New Year, I arrived at Harbor Hearth earlier than usual. When I unlocked the door, the scent of sweet bread from last night still lingered. I made coffee, sat at the counter, and saw an envelope in the wooden tray sender, just a few words on the front. For Juliet. Inside was a handwritten note in a familiar slanted script. "Juliet, I know you don't need an apology, but I have to say it anyway. I've lost everything. My shop, my name, my son, and the woman who once called me husband. I don't blame you. You only did what I never dared to do. If I could go back, I wish I had stopped at the first moment you went silent, because that was the sign I was too foolish to see. Edward." I finished reading, folded the letter, and put it in the drawer. No tears, no trembling. I only whispered, "Too late, Edward. Some apologies arrive right, but at the wrong time, and that makes them meaningless." That afternoon, Daniel and I brought pastries to the Central Church to donate to the orphanage. The old priest accepted them with a gentle smile. "Your pastries always smell like prayers," he said. I laughed. "Father, my prayers these days only smell like butter and eggs." He replied, "That's enough, as long as they're made with a true heart." His words stayed with me. A true heart used to think it was weak, soft, fragile, but in truth, it saved me. It reminded me that forgiveness isn't for the betrayer, but for the one who refuses to live forever in their anger. That night, I pulled out my old leather, the one where I'd first written my business plans. I flipped through its pages, recipes, client lists, and notes from employees. Then I added a new page. Harbor Hearth Phase 2, the Haven Project, a free training program for middle-aged women who've been abandoned or broken. Each new loaf will carry a story of starting over. I paused, smiling softly. Maybe every beginning needs an ending painful enough to remember. The next day, I brought the idea to the local women's council. They looked at a woman in her 60s, hair dusted with flour, eyes bright, and agreed immediately. "What shall we call it?" one asked. I answered without hesitation. The Haven Project, a place to begin again. A month later, the first class opened. 6 women walked in carrying their own story, their own hurt. One had lost her husband, her child had been abandoned, and one just wanted to speak without being interrupted. I looked at them and saw myself reflected in every gaze. "Here," I said, "we're not just learning to bake, we're learning to rebake our lives. This dough, you make it right, it will rise. If you make it wrong, you can start over, just like us." They laughed. The first laughter filled the kitchen that had once held only the mixer's hum and my sighs. I realized emotional justice was done. Now it was time for healing. That evening, as Daniel and I cleaned up, he said, "Mom, you're smiling more these days." I asked, "And you?" He smiled back, his eyes lighter. "I think maybe we're both learning how to live again in our own ways." I nodded. "Yes, and you know what? Sometimes the winner isn't the one who gets revenge, but the one who dares to start again without fear." Outside the window, the wind carried the smell of fresh bread. I stood there, watching the sign, "Harbor Hearth Made with Love," glow under the yellow light. Beneath it, the new line I had engraved, "And forged by truth." Have you ever forgiven someone not because they deserved it, but because you deserved peace? Stay tuned, because in the next part, Juliet will open the doors of the Haven Project and meet women who will remind her that it's never too late to begin again. On the first day of the Haven Project, Savannah had the kind of sunlight that felt like grace. The light filtered through the wooden windows, touching the flour-dusted tables and turning the air into golden dust. I stood in the middle of the wide kitchen, surrounded by the warm, sweet scent of freshly baked bread. It felt different from the day I opened my first shop. This time, I wasn't opening the doors to sell bread, but opening them to welcome those who had once fallen apart. 6 women walked in, each carrying a quiet story. Marjorie, 62, had just been left by her husband after 38 years of marriage by death, but by a secretary 20 years younger. Ellen, 57, had been kicked out of her home by her daughter when her son-in-law took over the family business. Clara, 70, had lived alone since her husband died, convinced her life no longer had meaning. The other three were younger and came more out of curiosity than conviction. They said they just wanted to learn how to bake good bread. But I knew no one came to the Haven Project just to learn to bake. They came because they were looking for a piece of themselves that someone else had taken. I greeted each of them with a light hug. "Here," I said, "we don't have to be perfect. Flour will spill, hands will shake, and sometimes the bread will burn. But that's okay. Every failure is just another batch of experience to try again." Marjorie laughed. "I think I'm already burnt to ashes." I smiled and handed her an apron. "Then today, we start baking again." The first lesson had no complicated recipes. I only taught them how to knead dough by hand. "Good bread begins with feeling," I said. "When the dough turns smooth, when your hands know it's ready." Clara laughed. "Like love?" I answered. "Except that if you knead it wrong, dough can still be saved. Love sometimes can't." The whole class burst out laughing. It was the kind of laughter that hadn't been heard from them in years. Free, loud, unguarded. It filled the room, mingling with the clink of metal bowls and the stirring of warm yeast. Watching them, I realized emotional justice doesn't always come from seeing the guilty punished, but from hearing laughter return to those who were once broken. By the third class, Marjorie brought a loaf she had baked at home. The crust was burnt, but the smell was beautiful. She placed it on the table, shyly smiling. "It's not pretty, but for my first time, I feel happy." I cut a slice and tasted it. "It's good. It tastes like patience." Marjorie laughed, her eyes glistening. "I used to think the only thing I was good at was crying. Now at least I know how to knead." That night, I went home late, feeling lighter. I realized I no longer dreamed of Edward. I no longer woke to the sound of doors creaking. Maybe when you start sharing warmth, ghosts know it's time to leave. One evening, after class ended, Ellen stayed behind to help clean up. "Juliet," she said, "I once saw the video about you. People called you the woman of justice." I chuckled softly. "That sounds too grand. I'm just a woman who got too tired of being silent." She nodded and looked at me for a long moment. "Don't you regret it?" "I regret forgiving too long," I said. "But I don't regret finally stopping." Ellen smiled sadly. "I wish I'd done that sooner. I let my daughter control my life through guilt. Now I have nothing left." I took her hand and squeezed it. "You still have yourself. And you have tomorrow's dough. Believe me, dough knows how to start over, and so do you." She smiled as tears fell onto the flour-dusted table, melting like salt. In that moment, I realized I was no longer the one being helped, but the one helping, and that was its own kind of rebirth. A week later, we held our first bake sale to raise funds for the Women's Center. The day was cold, but the sun glowed golden. The smell of bread filled the street, drawing curious passers-by. Marjorie sold the loaves, Ellen handled the cash box, and I stood behind the wooden table, watching them laugh, talk, and invite people to taste. A young woman stopped by and said to Ellen, "Ma'am, this bread is delicious. Where did you learn to bake?" Ellen smiled and replied, "At a place where they don't just teach baking, they teach how to stand up again." Her words made my heart tremble. I looked around, and one remembered that Harbor Hearth had once held betrayal. Now it was the Haven, a place of beginnings. That night, while cleaning up, Clara asked, "Juliet, don't you plan to love again?" I laughed. "I think my heart is like an old oven still warm, but no longer made for big flames." "But maybe someone just wants to share the warmth," she said. I smiled, watching the light reflect off the countertop. "Maybe, but this time, I won't open the door because someone is knocking. I'll open it because I want to." That night I came home late. Daniel waited by the door, holding a box of my favorite. "Mom, I visited your class today. They call you Miss Juliet, not Mrs. Roberts. You were smiling the whole time." I smiled and sat beside him. "Yes." Because today I understood something. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's living on without needing an explanation. Daniel was quiet for a while, then asked, "Mom, if one day Dad apologizes, will you forgive him?" I thought for a moment and answered slowly, "Yes, but not to give him peace, to give myself peace." Before bed, I stopped by the bakery alone. Moonlight streamed through the window, shining on rows of golden loaves. I turned on the light, and the gentle scent of butter filled the air. I opened the notebook that listed the students' names. Beneath Marjorie, Ellen, Clara, I added a new line: Juliet Roberts, student number 7. Because I knew that in this journey, I was also learning to trust, to love myself, to live slowly, without feeling lonely. I closed the notebook and looked out the window. Outside, Savannah was quiet, and for the first time in years, so was my heart. Do you believe that sometimes the most beautiful revenge is becoming someone pain can no longer define? Stay tuned, because in the next part, Juliet will meet someone unexpected from her past, and that encounter will close her 40-year journey in the gentlest way possible. May. Savannah was warm again. Along Bay Street, magnolia trees had started to bloom white, their sweet scent swirling through the air like a memory that wanted to return. I had just finished the morning class at the Haven Project when I received a short message. "Juliet, I'm at the old cafe. If you can, meet me for a moment. Edward." I stared at the words for a long time. 2 years ago, just seeing his name on the screen would have made my heart tighten and my hands shake. Now my heart still beats, but slowly, calmly, like the ticking of the clock hanging in the shop. Steady, familiar, no longer threatening. I didn't reply right away. I made another pot of tea, closed the oven door, and asked Daniel to watch the store. He asked, "Going somewhere, Mom?" I answered softly, "To meet someone from the past. Just this once." Daniel nodded, his eyes no longer sharp with resentment. Maybe he, too, had learned that forgiveness isn't weakness, laying down the sword after victory. The cafe sat on the corner where Edward and I had met for the first time. It was where he once said, "Juliet, if you're ever sad, remember the coffee here is always bitter, but after the bitterness comes cocoa, just like us." I never thought, 20 years later, I'd still remember that linen for love, but because it was true. When I walked in, he was already seated in the far corner by the window. No suit, no tie, just a gray sweater, slightly hunched shoulders, and more silver in his hair. In front of him sat 2 cups of coffee, one hot, one cold. "You came," he said quietly. I sat down. "You still remember I like this spot?" "Hard to forget," he smiled faintly. "Every time I pass by, I still imagine you sitting by the window, writing recipes in that old leather notebook." I said nothing. Outside, the sunlight slanted across the table, reflecting gold on the same hands that once trembled holding proof of betrayal, now still and calm. He was silent for a moment, then said, "I know I have no right, but I wanted to thank you for letting me lose everything." I looked up and smiled faintly. Strange. People rarely thank someone for their losses. "No," he replied. "I thank you because if I hadn't lost it all, I would never have known how foolish I was. You were right. Sometimes a woman's silence is an indictment." I looked straight at him. No anger, no affection, just clarity. The man sitting before me was no longer the betrayer from memory. He was just an old man facing his past. "Where do you live now?" I asked. "A small apartment near the docks." Allison left. She took the savings and left a note thanking me for the valuable life lessons. He gave a broken laugh. "I guess that's the price of not valuing what's real." I didn't laugh, I only nodded. "Do you think you deserved it?" I think I did. But more than that, I needed to understand why. He looked out the window. "I always treated your kindness as a given, your silence as consent. I forgot that love has an expiration date. If you don't tend to it, it molds." I took a sip of coffee, bitter but right. "Do you regret it, Edward?" He sighed. "Not for loving the wrong person, but for hurting the right one." We sat in silence. The cafe was quiet. Old jazz played Autumn Leaves. I looked out at the street, where real leaves drifted in the sunlight. "What did you want to say to me?" I asked. He reached into his pocket and placed an envelope on the table. "This is the transfer of my remaining shares. Harbor Hearth should belong fully to you." I gently pushed it back. "That's not necessary. I already have enough." "But Edward," I interrupted, "what I needed to reclaim, I already did. My dignity, my faith, and my peace. Keep the rest as a reminder of what you once lost." He looked at me for a long moment. There was no arrogance in his eyes now, only a quiet kind of sadness that comes when you realize you're just a supporting character in someone else's story. "I only hope one day Daniel might talk to me." I replied softly, "That's no longer mine to give, but you can start by living honestly." He nodded, eyes damp. "I heard you opened a training program. They call it the Haven Project?" "Yes." "You always knew how to turn ashes into light, Juliet. You still make people believe in good." I smiled. "And you still remind me that goodness needs protecting." Before leaving, he asked, "Can you forgive me?" I paused at the doorway, looking through the glass where our reflections overlapped past, one present. "I already have," I said, "but not for you. For myself, for loving someone too long, and for finally stopping." Then I stepped out, the savannah sunlight breaking wide before me. Behind me, the soft chime of the doorbell was the sound of a chapter closing. That afternoon, I returned to the bakery. Daniel was teaching the new group how to sprinkle sugar on tarts. I watched him, the light falling gently on his serious but kind face. "You're getting better than me," I said. Daniel laughed. "I'm just learning from someone who knew how to start over after losing everything." I stepped closer, took his hand, still dusted with flour. "No, Daniel, I didn't lose anything. I just gave back what wasn't mine." Late that night, I sat on the porch, where the lavender had begun to bloom. The sea breeze carried salt and the warmth of summer. I opened my leather, and the last page was still blank. I wrote, "Forgiveness is when you can retell the story without your voice shaking. I've done that. And if anyone asks, I'll say, love doesn't end, it just changes shape, from binding to freedom, from tears to peace." I closed the notebook and exhaled. In the distance, the city lights shimmered on the river like sugar crystals dissolving in tea. For the first time in 40 years, I felt light as flour, ready to be kneaded, baked, and become something new, something warm. Have you ever met the person who once broke you and realized you no longer need their apology? If you have, tell me from which city, from what corner of life, because maybe your story will become the next chapter of Begin Again stories. A year after meeting Edward again, Savannah was in the spring. Lavender bloomed along the fence, its gentle fragrance drifting through the air like the breath of a new morning. I sat on the porch, a cup of herbal tea in hand, watching Daniel lock the door of Harbor Hearth across the street. He had changed the sign, "Harbor Hearth, a place to begin again." I didn't interfere. In fact, he was the one who suggested that name, saying, "Mom, this bakery isn't just yours anymore. It's a place where people who've fallen are taught to stand again." Every time I saw that sign glowing under the sunlight, I knew that was my legacy. Not bread, not a brand, but renewal itself. In the mornings, when I walked into the Haven Project, the kitchen was already alive. Marjorie was mixing dough, Ellen measured butter, and 2 new students, Nora and Faith, were laughing over their clumsy attempts at whisking eggs. I stood in the doorway, silently watching. Women who once carried pain now laughing amid the scent of sugar and light. "I used to think only tears could wash memories clean," I said, "but it turns out flour and laughter can too." The class paused, then smiled at me. Ellen called out, "Miss Juliet, tell us the story about the day you started over." I laughed. "If I tell you that, you'll forget to check the oven temperature." Marjorie joked, "That's fine. A burned batch is easier to remember." Laughter filled the room. The oven dinged, and the first tray of the morning came out golden, the air rich with butter and warmth. Watching them, I thought, this is the sound of life after the storm, not loud but warm. In the afternoon, Daniel stopped by the class. He wore a white shirt, hair neatly cut, looking more grounded than ever. When he walked in, the women cheered. "Oh, Daniel, Miss Juliet's son is here." He blushed and smiled shyly. I looked at him and saw in his eyes something I once feared was gone: faith. After class, we cleaned up together. Daniel asked, "Mom, have you ever thought about leaving Savannah?" I shook my head. No, I once thought I needed to go far away to forget, but I realized all I needed was to stay long enough to turn the place that hurt me into one that heals others. He looked at me and said softly, "You've done that." I smiled. "And so have you by helping me keep this fire burning." That evening, we brought pastries to the church for the children's group. A little girl named Lily, about 7, with golden hair and blue eyes as clear as the sky, ran up and hugged me. "Miss Juliet, your bread is the best in the world!" I laughed, brushing her hair. "You know, sweetie, bread isn't good because of the recipe. It's good because the baker puts her heart into it." Lily's eyes widened. "Where's your heart?" I pointed to my chest. "Here. But a little piece of it is in every loaf you hold." The girl giggled and ran off. Daniel watched her go and said quietly, "I think you're not just baking bread, Mom. You're baking hope." I smiled. Hope always needs fire, and we've learned not to fear fire anymore. That night, after closing the shop, I sat alone inside. The clock ticked steadily. I opened my old leather notebook, its edges yellowed with age. On the first page, I had once written, "I will start again, even if no one believes I can." Beneath it, I added a new line, "And I was not alone." I ran my hand over the words. The warm light shone on the wooden table, over faint traces of flower-like fingerprints from the past. A few days later, the Haven Project was invited for a local TV interview. The host asked, "Miss Juliet, what made you want to start this project at 65? I replied, "Because one day I realized I had lived too long for others and never truly for myself. I don't want other women to wait until they've lost everything to learn that." The young reporter smiled. "So what's the recipe for happiness at your age?" I laughed. "Knowing when to stay quiet, when to walk away, and when to bake another batch." The studio erupted in laughter, and inside, I felt as light as air. That evening, Daniel and I sat on the porch, watching the city lights shimmer on the river. "Mom," he said, "tomorrow I have a meeting with the city council. They want to expand the Haven Project to 3 other towns." I turned to him, surprised. "Really?" He nodded. "I'll help you make it happen. You just keep teaching." I was quiet for a moment, then took his hand. "Daniel, thank you. I thought my legacy would end here." He smiled, his eyes bright. "It won't, Mom. What you've done doesn't stop at this street. It lives in everyone you've touched." I looked at the same boy who once carried anger, now calm like a scar healed smooth. And I understood that healing isn't just for yourself, but for those you love. Late that night, after Daniel went to bed, I walked into the kitchen. Beside the oven sat 2 freshly baked loaves, one large, one small. I wrote 2 notes. For the one who continues this journey. For the one who dared to begin again. I turned off the lights, leaving only the soft glow from the oven, where a small flame still burned steadily. In that light, I looked down at my hands, longer trembling, no longer bruised by anger. Only faint calluses remained, beautiful in their quiet strength. I thought, maybe life is like these hands. After all the pain, what remains isn't the scar, but the strength to touch the world without fear. The next morning, when Daniel opened the shop, sunlight poured in, glinting on rows of golden bread. On the wall, a small brass plaque gleamed. The Haven Project, founded by Juliet Roberts, 1958, because it's never too late to begin again. He turned to me and said, "Mom, I'm keeping this exactly as it is." I smiled. "Don't keep it for me. Keep it for everyone who comes after to remind them that every beginning is worth it." Have you ever thought it was too late to start over until you saw someone like you stand up again? Stay tuned, because in the final part, Juliet will write the last chapter in her leather notebook, The Light at Day's End, where she passes on her legacy and finds her lasting peace. A year after the Haven Project expanded, spring returned to Savannah. Across the sky, flocks of migrating birds glided by, their shadows rippling over the river's shimmering surface. I sat at the old oak table where the sign, Harbor Hearth Made with Love, once stood, a steaming cup of herbal tea before me, and my worn leather notebook open at the corner. Outside, Daniel was speaking with the new group of trainees. Their laughter drifted in through the open window, mingling with the smell of bread and the lavender from the porch. The house, once a battlefield between love and betrayal, became a shelter for life itself. I turned the pages of the notebook. On the first pages, the ink had faded, the handwriting shaky, like the voice of someone who had cried too long. But the last page I had left blank for today. I wrote, "I once thought justice meant seeing the betrayer pay. But true justice is when you no longer wish to see them hurt, because that's when you know you are truly free." I set the pen down and inhaled deeply. The scent of mint and ginger tea filled the air. Sunlight poured through the window, tracing a golden stripe across the table, just like that morning long ago when I sat here holding the tube of superglue I found in place of the lubricant Edward had hidden. That moment once made me tremble. Now I smiled. It's strange how time heals through silence. It doesn't apologize, it doesn't repay, simply lets you live long enough to watch the wound close on its own. By noon, I stepped into the garden. The lavender beds were in full bloom, a sea of violets stretching across the yard. On the porch, Marjorie was teaching the new students how to cool the pastries, while Ellen jotted down new recipes for the class in Charleston. I stood there, watching them, feeling a kind of peace that had no name, not joy, but quiet fulfillment, the kind that comes when you know your journey has reached its natural end. Daniel came over and placed a hand on my shoulder. "You have a visitor today," he said. "Me?" I asked. He nodded. "Someone from the TV station. They're filming a short piece about the Haven Project about you." I laughed. "Oh, I'm just a baker." "No," Daniel smiled. "You're someone who turns dough into belief." That afternoon, the crew set up their cameras on the porch. The sunset poured golden light across the yard, coating everything in the color of honey. The young reporter asked, "Miss Juliet, if you could say one thing to the woman you were back then, one sitting in a cold house, discovering her husband's betrayal, what would it be?" I was silent for a few seconds. In that pause, the memories returned. The tube of lubricant replaced with glue, the toppled chair, my strangled laugh in a room full of light. I remembered the chill on my skin, the pounding in my chest, the shame filling every breath. Then I said softly, "I'd tell her not to be afraid, because sometimes what breaks us is the very thing that opens the path to who we're meant to be." The reporter asked, "Do you regret anything?" I smiled, my eyes drifting into the distance. "No, because I've learned that some things aren't meant to be kept, not even the past." When the camera stopped rolling, I stayed behind, listening to the faint sound of waves. The sun was sinking, its light brushing over my hair, silver, but glinting like threads of gold. That night after filming, I received a small envelope in the mail. The sender's name read E. Roberts. Inside was a single photograph. Edward standing in front of the Haven Project Charleston, holding a loaf of bread. On the back, a short message read, "Thank you for teaching me what I once believed to be the truth." I looked at the photo for a long time. No pain, no bitterness, only gratitude, like smiling at an old memory. I placed the photo inside my notebook, between two pages, starting over and forgiveness. Let the past rest between those two exactly where it belongs. The next morning, Daniel came to pick me up for the opening of the third Haven Project Center in Asheville. The car moved along the highway, flanked by rows of tall green pines. I looked out the window, watching sunlight dance across the glass. "Do you remember the first day I opened the class?" I asked. Daniel smiled. "I do. You had 6 students, 1 old oven, and a tiny bit of faith." I chuckled. "And now you have a generation who believes. Not just in you," Daniel said, "but in the idea that every life can rise again." The ceremony was simple. Loaves of bread lined up on wooden tables, women of all ages raising cups of cocoa together. I gave a short speech. "We can't change the past, but we can choose how to tell it. Every time I bake, I'm not just baking dough, I'm baking memories until they're sweet enough to swallow." Applause filled the room. In the crowd, I saw familiar faces. Marjorie, Ellen, Clara, women who had once fallen, now standing tall, eyes shining brighter than any oven flame. That night, I returned to the porch in Savannah. The sky was full of stars. The sound of waves came softly and steadily, like the heartbeat of someone at peace. I opened my notebook and wrote the final lines. I once thought my life ended with betrayal, but it was only the first chapter of freedom. I once thought I'd lost everything, but now I have what matters most: truth, my son, and peace. If anyone asks, I'll say, it's never too late to begin again. I closed the notebook and set it beside my still warm teacup. Through the window, the lights of Harbor Hearth were still glowing, Daniel and the trainees cleaning up, their laughter mingling with the clinking of cups. I whispered to myself, almost like a song, Harbor Hearth made with love, forged by truth. Then I closed my eyes not to sleep, but to remember this moment when past, present, and future finally met, like the light at day's end rippling over the river. Do you believe it's never too late to begin again, whether you're 35, 55, or 75? Tell me, where are you beginning again from so that the begin again stories can continue to be written from lives like yours?